outline some of my family's farming experiences. Our dairy farm was in a 30-inch rainfall area. In the 1960s, we produced 200,000 litres of milk and it was profitable. In 2004, we produced 1.2 million litres, which is a six-fold increase, but I stopped dairying because it was marginal. This had nothing to do with the farm's productivity or rainfall, but plenty to do with the low milk prices. The fact is, every business can be marginal at some time, and mostly when prices fall. Over the years, I've seen many things increase production on our properties. For example, irrigation, better species of pasture, fertilisers, water spreading, high density short period grazing, better stock genetics, and adding nutritional supplements. Native animals that graze have also benefited from more grass and watering points being around. The extra watering points across our landscape allows them to sometimes get to plague proportions if they're not controlled or harvested. But most of our farming methods have become portrayed negatively by different lobby groups in recent years. They use words such as unnatural or non-native or exploitative to condemn something which does not suit their philosophy or belief. I then started to wonder why Australian farmers have become portrayed as evil, because logic would say that being able to improve productivity and feed more people while improving various native fauna survival should be seen as good. I also know that if farmers had the encouragement to take up the best technologies available, we could sustainably produce many times what we're now producing. Do you know how much of Australia's food production is exported? Well, it's around 70%. But do you know how much of Australia's land surface is irrigated? That is just 1%. Now, how much of Australia's farm production comes from that irrigated 1% of our land mass? It's almost 50%. That's right, half of our farm production comes from just 1% of our land mass, the irrigated bit. So if you do the sums, Australia produces almost double what we need from just 1% of our land mass. To go a step further, how much of the world's surface is warm, temperate desert? It's around 30%, which is 4 times the area that is currently farmed all over the world. Do we have the technology to desalinate seawater and transform desert areas? Well, the answer to that is yes. So, if we already have this know-how and the technology to feed the world, why do people starve? The United Nations says it's not the lack of resources or economic solutions, but the lack of political momentum. To be more precise, a lack of stable government, a lack of secure property rights, which is being able to own land and stock and borrow money against that asset, a lack of freedoms, and finally a lack of belief that they, the people, can do something themselves about their own situation. Now, what about the difference in beliefs of green activists to primary producers? Green activists do not support property rights. They're happy to remove water and land rights from landholders anytime. Here's a situation in Queensland where the land in the foreground has timber thickening and the grasses die out. In the background is the same land, but it has been regenerated by pulling the trees over and growing grasses that will not grow under the original tree canopy. This occurs across millions of hectares in northern Australia. The trees regrow, but the land requires being regenerated every 10 to 15 years. It is now illegal to manage the land this way thanks to the federal and state Australian governments are wanting Kyoto carbon credits. This is one example of farmers losing their freedoms and their rights to be productive and land-caring people. Here's another example. The land care work that I organised in Aramac under a water spreading project resulted in myself being a runner-up in the 1999 Queensland Land Care Research Award. A few months later, however, the Queensland Government made several of the land care practices we'd used become effectively illegal. Things like stick raking timber into rows to slow water runoff, burning old rank grasses to freshen them up, and putting up new fences in some parts of our properties, they were argued as destroying the environment. But the beliefs of the Queensland bureaucracy and government could not be changed. After a 3-hour discussion with the Queensland Premier, I realised the removal of rights and freedoms appeared environmental, but was really a front for the real battle, which is between a belief in centralised government control versus that of the local grassroots community being able to make those decisions. Whether we like it or not, the battle is really who gets the power. We only have the rights others allow us to have. The climate change issue is a good example of how we are headed for a totalitarian regime. First, there is the propaganda which is fed to the media, so the media is happily complicit with green sensationalism, reporting anything that can possibly keep the hysteria going. Then there is the facts being denied by the spin of the Greens. For example, while the world is not getting warmer for the last 9 years, Greens say global warming continues. While CO2 does almost nothing towards increasing temperatures, Greens say it is the only thing that increases temperature. While the science shows there is no greenhouse signature in the atmosphere, Greens will not discuss this, but attack the scientists saying these things. And finally, there are the rights of ordinary people that will be removed little by little. Already landholders like myself have had various vegetation and land management rights removed due to the Kyoto Protocol. The recent higher prices for food due to subsidies to use crops as fuels rather than food is the next step. This is going to increase poverty. And ultimately, there will be a world environmental body set up with a tax system which will determine how many carbon dioxide emissions you can emit, which will result in controlling the basics of the middle and low income people's living conditions. Farmers and businesses and ordinary people are working towards their own demise by going along with the global warming hype. They're going to pay dearly for a centralised worldwide control of how much fuel and energy they can use to solve a problem that is not there. The last point that influenced our reason to stop being farmers is what the Wall Street Journal has identified as rural cleansing. This is when the majority urban community dominates each government's decisions, so the rural community gets less consideration, which means it becomes poorer and poorer. Rural infrastructure and services continually reduce, and rural children are forced to leave their community to find work in the cities. So the pressures of rural cleansing, along with the amount of unnecessary paperwork and hurdles to jump just to satisfy centralised government bureaucracies, was for us too exhausting. This was taking us away from our love of working with the land. And so it's time to go. We also think the injustices we faced should be reversed, and that is the subject of Part 3.